December 1944. The Ardennes forest was so white it hurt to look at. Snow lay over the trees like a burial shroud, so bright at dawn it made men squint and curse under their breath. To the German officers along the Siegfried Line, it looked like victory. Clean, silent, absolute. They believed winter itself was on their side. The cold would finish what their bullets started. Freeze the wounded in the ditches before the medics could drag them back. In a report after reporting to Berlin, the same smug line kept appearing. The Americans have machines, but they bleed like children. One of the men writing those reports was a medical officer, Captain Deerhoss. He was not a sadist. He was a surgeon with a notebook and a belief that war obeyed numbers. In his journal, under the smell of ether and gunpowder, he wrote a sentence that still chills you when you read it today. You can measure the strength of an army by how quickly its wounded die. From where he sat, the math looked simply. American convoys bogged in snow, aid stations are overflowing, glass bottles of blood arriving solid as rocks, cracking like candy under the heater. Radio intercepts showed casualty lists that spiked every time the temperature dropped. Men who should have lived in summer were gone within hours in winter. To Hoss, it was proof. Proof that discipline beats technology. Proof that an army that fights with gadgets cannot outlast one that fights with endurance. While he raised his glass over schnapps and talked about superiority, another world existed just a few miles away. In the ruins of Bastogne and Luxembourg, American medics dragged stretchers through slush that stank of diesel and blood. Inside, shattered churches turned into aid stations, candles flickered over rows of men shaking from cold. The air was thick with the iron tongue of blood and the sour bite of fear. Bottles of precious donated blood were lined up on makeshift shelves, most of them spider-webbed with cracks, the contents useless. When one soldier died, his dog tag went onto a nail, hammered into the wall. By January, the beams looked like metal hedgehogs. Somewhere in that chaos, a young nurse stared at the last bottle as it shattered in her hands and watched the only chance a man had spill into the dirt. She did not quote equations. She did not toast victory. She muttered something so simple it barely sounded like strategy at all. If we cannot store life, we cannot save it. That winter, both sides thought they understood how this story would end. The Germans believed the cold would do their killing for them. The Americans believed more tanks, more trucks, more planes would eventually grind the enemy down. Almost nobody was looking at the small, ugly truth in the middle, that glass breaks, blood freezes, and a wounded man does not care who has more artillery if there is nothing left to put in his veins. If you still think wars are only decided by guns, generals, and big red arrows on a map, stay with me. Because within 90 days, the neat little equation in Captain Hoss's notebook would be worthless. Entire American units that should have been corpses would be walking back into the line. German officers would be staring at their casualty reports, asking the same unnerving question: why are these men not staying dead? And the answer would not come from a laboratory, or a general briefing, or a famous surgeon in a spotless coat. It would start in a freezing tent with an exhausted nurse, a pair of shaking hands, and a torn rubber glove she refused to throw away. If you believe one overlooked mind can change the rules of survival, tap like right now and drop a 7 in the comments. Because this is the story of the war that was partly won by something soft enough to hold blood and tough enough to outlast winter, December 1944. The deeper the Allies pushed into the Ardennes, the more the cold turned against them. Snow piled in, trenches like concrete. Coffee freezes in tin cups. Medics warmed their hands over exhaust pipes just so they could hold a scalpel. And the worst enemy wasn't the Germans, it was glass. American blood transfusions depended on fragile bottles shipped from Paris and England. By the time they reached the front, the bottles were often frozen solid. When nurses tried to thaw them, the glass burst with a soft crack, spilling the only thing that could keep a wounded man alive. Inside field hospitals, shattered churches, barns, tents. The smell was unforgettable: wet wool, diesel heaters, iron and rot. The wounded weren't bleeding out on operating tables. They were freezing out. At one station near Luxembourg, 12 men died in a single morning. Not from headshots, not from burns, not from catastrophic wounds. They simply needed blood, and there was none left that hadn't turned to ice. Meanwhile, on the other side of the snow, German Med Officer Captain Deer Hoss watched it, all with cold confidence. In his neat handwriting he recorded, "The Americans have machines, but their wounded die too quickly. Winter shall finish them." To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was arithmetic. The old arithmetic of war. Glass breaks, blood freezes, men die. And for a while, he was right. Casualty reports confirmed it. American survival rates plunged. Winter was killing more effectively than shrapnel. But then something strange happened. Units that should have been crippled were returning to combat. Soldiers who'd lost liters of blood were walking again within days. Hoss dismissed it as rumor until the day his men captured a wounded American lieutenant carrying something impossible: a small, flexible pouch, warm, unbroken, filled with blood that had not frozen. It made no sense. Not yet. Because the person who built it, tired, shivering, covered in dried plasma, was about to tear open the rule book of battlefield medicine. Lieutenant Clara Daniels hadn't slept for 30 hours. Her uniform was stiff with frozen plasma, her hands cracked from cold, and the last bottle of blood in the tent had just shattered in her grip, exploding into red slush across the dirt. Captain Lewis, the field surgeon, sighed with a voice that sounded 20 years older. "Then we choose," he said, "morphine or prayers." It wasn't cynicism, it was math, and the math was winning. That night, after losing another young corporal who begged her not to let him fall asleep, Clara walked into the snow just to breathe. The cold bit her skin. The world was silent, except for distant artillery. She stared at her own hand, gloves torn from overuse, latex still warm, still flexible, still alive in the cold where glass had failed. And then the thought came, simple, stupid, impossible. Why do we keep blood in glass when our bodies keep it in skin? She went back inside and began assembling what looked like madness: a rubber glove, a length of salvaged IV tubing, alcohol for sterilizing a bit of tape stolen from the signal corps, a glass syringe that rattled in her shaking hands. She filled the glove with saline. No leaks. She cut off one finger and slid the tube inside. Still sealed, she warmed it near the heater. The latex softened instead of cracking. Then, the moment no medical textbook on earth would ever approve, she tested it on herself. Needle in her own arm, saline dripping from a glove-turned blood bag. The flow is steady. The pressure is perfect. It worked. The next day, the wounded poured into the tent again. Young men grey from blood loss, eyes unfocused, life slipping minute by minute. One soldier, barely 20, had a femoral wound that gave him 15 minutes at most. Captain Lewis shook his head. "He won't make it." Clara held up her gloves. "Let me try." Lewis hesitated, then murmured what every battlefield doctor eventually says when hope is gone. "He's already dying. Do what you want." She drew blood from a donor, filtered it through gauze, filled the glove, tied it off, hung it from a metal hook, and connected the tube. The tent went silently, a slow drip, a flex of the latex, a hint of color returning to the boy's face. 10 minutes passed, then 15. His pulse steadied, his breathing evened. Clara looked up to see every medic frozen in disbelief. Captain Lewis leaned in, checked the vital signs, and whispered the words that would echo through the next 90 days. "Well, I'll be DM'd." By nightfall, medics were copying her design with gloves, condoms, raincoat scraps, whatever flexible material they could find. The Daniels bag, as they started calling it, wasn't pretty. It wasn't official. It wasn't approved. But it was the first blood bag ever used successfully in war, and it was about to change everything. Word about Clara's strange rubber pouch didn't spread through paperwork. It spread through whispers. Medics passing each other in the dark said the same thing. The glove works. It doesn't freeze. It doesn't break. By the second week, what started with one nurse became a quiet, unstoppable contagion of survival. Medics tore apart raincoats to make bags. Some used medical tubing, others bicycle valves. One sergeant stitched 2 gloves together over a stove and bragged it held pressure better than glass. They weren't following regulations, they were the following results. And the results were impossible to ignore. In Clara's unit alone, 30 critical patients, 26 lived. Wounded men who should have bled out in minutes were walking within days. Color returning to faces that were grey hours earlier, a pulse restored with nothing more than a warm hand holding a pouch close to the chest. Across the Ardennes, something new appeared on tree branches, tank turrets, jeep, mirrors, even rifles planted in snow. Not flags, not signals, blood bags, red pouches swaying like small hearts in the cold. The Third Army's medical division noticed first. Their reports didn't know what to call the devices. They wrote flexible containers of unknown origin, but the numbers were undeniable. Hemorrhage deaths dropped, transfusion success tripled. Units returned to combat faster than any winter before. Back in the monastery turn hospital near Koblenz, Clara trained medics non-stop sealing latex, preventing air bubbles, warming pouches with body heat. Her notebook filled with scribbles, flow rates, temperatures, blood types, survival times. She wasn't chasing credit, she was chasing for a few minutes. Second, heartbeats. A war correspondent visited and wrote that Clara worked as if she'd told death to wait. He snapped a photo of her under a rack of glowing red pouches. Soldiers mailed that picture home, wives pinned to kitchen walls. Kids pointed and asked, "Is that how they live again?" But the enemy saw it too. German intelligence filed a report noting American casualties surviving catastrophic blood loss. One officer wrote a line that spread through Allied ranks like gasoline on fire. The Americans have found a way to stop dying. And he was right, because somewhere in that monastery, Clara Daniels was no longer improvising. She was an engineer, refining, perfecting. And her invention was born in snow tape. Desperation was about to hit the desks of commanders who had no idea a nurse had just rewired the rules of war. By early spring 1945, the front shifted like a giant wound trying to close. Towns burned, rivers thawed, men marched forward, and Clara's little red pouches followed them everywhere. Everywhere, except for the paperwork. Inside a captured monastery near Koblenz, Clara had turned her corner of the war into a living laboratory. Her first glove had become a proper pouch oval, single chamber, tubing sealed tight, pressure steady. She ran experiments with a pocket watch. She added sodium citrate to stop clotting. She even discovered the pouch's elasticity naturally regulated flow through a primitive accidental mimic of a human vein. Captain Lewis, once her biggest skeptic, now worked at her side as a quiet apprentice. But outside that monastery, a storm of bureaucracy was gathering. When inspectors arrived, Clara hid her pouches under the blankets. Official regulations still demanded glass. And unofficially, the army wasn't ready to admit that its next big medical breakthrough had come from a freezing tent, not a laboratory. Still, the truth moved faster than orders. Hospitals across the Third Army were making their own versions. Survival rates soared. Quartermasters rerouted rubber supplies meant for tires. Commanders wanted more bags, not names. In April, Clara was summoned to demonstrate the device to a panel of officers inside a draft warehouse. She spoke plainly, showed how glass froze, how latex flexed, how blood kept moving when every other system failed. They watched as the transfusion stabilized a patient in minutes. One officer asked, "Who authorized this?" Clara answered, "No one, sir." His reply was simple, "Then it doesn't officially exist." Yet that same week, a typed order landed on her desk, effective immediately. All European field hospitals will adopt flexible transfusion containers. Train new units within 72 hours. No signature, no credit, just urgent. The war ended soon after. The last soldier she saved, a boy from Wisconsin, saluted her with shaky hands and said, "Ma'am, you should get a medal for this." She smiled softly. "You're alive." That's the medal. 3 weeks later, her unit disbanded. She went home to Kansas with a small trunk, a fading notebook, and a secret history the world never asked her to tell. In 1946, military scientists introduced a new invention, the PL-146 plastic blood bag. They called it a recent laboratory innovation. No mention of mud, snow, diesel lamps, or Clara Daniels. Her wartime reports were filed under miscellaneous field adaptations. Her name quietly dissolved into the archives. Years later, a journalist tracked her down after hearing whispers of a nurse who started it all. He found her on a clinic step, wearing a cardigan, holding a thermos of coffee. "Is it true you invented the field blood bag?" She smiled, tired and gentle. "I wasn't trying to invent anything. I was trying to stop them from dying." He wrote it down. He never published it. When Clara died in 1973, the obituary was 2 lines. No medals, no breakthroughs, no mention of the winter she defeated, but her invention lived on. Every hospital, every ambulance, every battlefield after her, every drip of warm blood flowing into someone who refuses to die, that is her legacy. And in a museum today, behind glass, hangs an old latex pouch labeled "Field Blood Container Origin Unknown." Unknown to the visitors, but not history, not to the soldiers who lived, and not to anyone who is hearing this story now. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world celebrated generals, strategists, tank aces, and commanders. Clara Daniels went home quietly to a small clinic in Kansas, where no one knew that tens of thousands of soldiers had survived because she refused to let blood freeze in a glove. But her invention never stopped fighting. Every modern blood bag, PVC, plastic, medical-grade polymer, traces its shape, its purpose, its survival back to a freezing tent, a kerosene lamp, and a nurse who simply refused to watch another man die. You won't find that story in most textbooks. You won't hear her name at military parades. And in the museum, where an early pouch hangs behind glass, the label still reads, "Origin Unknown." But here's the truth. Most history books miss. Wars aren't only won by artillery and armor. Sometimes they're won by mercy, by improvisation, by a single mind that refuses to accept the old mathematics of dying. Captain Deerhoss, the German officer who believed winter would break the Americans, later wrote a line that should be carved in stone. "They won because they learned to save life faster than we learned to take it." That is Clara's victory. Not medals, not promotions, not ceremonies. Her victory is every soldier who walked back into sunlight, every heartbeat revived under a red pouch swaying from a Jeep mirror. Every future transfusion saved someone who never knew her name. Legacy isn't always carved of marble. Sometimes it's carried in veins. If you believe history forgets, the wrong people drop a 7 inches the comments. And if you want more, hidden stories like these, stories of forgotten heroes, strange inventions, and moments that quietly changed the course of war, hit like right now and stays for the next episode. because the next story is just as unbelievable.